All right, guys, we are doing the Oil Spill Remediation Lab. So this is a 5-day lab. So I'm going to show you how to set it up, and then each day we'll come back and we'll check the results and take some data. So right now I have 4 culture tubes. In test tube 1, I have 2 mils of the tetrazolium indicator. Indicators are going to change color to show you that something has happened. In test tube 2, I have also added 2 mils of the tetrazolium indicator. Notice that right now it's clear. So we're looking for a color change to something else other than clear. To keep the volume the same and have a controlled variable, I have added 2 mils of distilled water into test tubes 3 and 4. Now I am going to add our oil. So our oil is going to be sunflower oil. And I'm going to add 10 drops of oil to each test tube. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That 10th one's rolling. 2, 3, 4. All right, so there is our oil. Now, what we are going to try and do is to see if we can remediate or clean up our oil. So in order to do that, we're going to be adding a bacteria whose job is to actually clean up various items, specifically grease and oil. This comes from Ridex. So I'm going to add 2 mils of Ridex. Now the Ridex was cultured last night. Trying to get some without the grit in it. I'm going to add 2 mils of Ridex to test tube. I'm going to add test tube 2. And I'm going to add another 2 mils to test tube 4. Okay, now in order to keep the volume the same and have a controlled variable, we're going to add 2 mils of distilled water to test tubes 1 and 3. That keeps the volume the same for all of the test tubes. A little too much there. Get this 2 mils. There we go. All right, so everything has been added. So really to take a look at these, you can see test tube 1 all clear. Test tube 2 is a little cloudy. That has the microbial suspension. Test tube 3 all clear. And test tube 4 also cloudy because it has a microbial suspension. So we'll come back tomorrow and we will check and see if there's any change in color or other types of appearance. All right, guys, so here is day 2 of the Oil Spill Remediation Lab. So we're going to check our progress. Test tube 1 is still clear and colorless. Remember that test tube 1 had the tetrazolium, the oil, and distilled water. Test tube 2 has a slight pinkness to it, and you can see some cloudiness in the bottom as I swirl it. So you can see that there is, the indicator is showing that something is going on. This is the tetrazolium, the oil, and the microbial suspension. Test tube 3 is clear and colorless. It has oil, distilled water, and distilled water. So clear and colorless. Test tube number 4 has a little bit of cloudiness to it. Okay, this had the distilled water, the oil, and the microbial suspension. So it's got a little bit of cloudiness to it. Okay, still colorless, but got a little slight cloud to it. So that is day 2. We'll come back on day 3 and take observations again. All right, guys, so here we are, day number 3, and we're going to look at the results again. Test tube 1 that has the tetrazolium, oil, and water is still clear and colorless. Test tube number 2 that has the tetrazolium, oil, and microbial suspension is still a faint pink. You can see the cloudiness, which is the microbial suspension itself. Test tube number 3, which has water, oil, and then water again, is still clear and colorless. And then test tube number 4, which has water, oil, and microbial suspension, is colorless. You can see that mixing up and swirling as I shake it. That is the microbial suspension. All right, so that is day number 3. We'll check it again on day number 4. All right, guys, here we are on day 3 looking at our results. Test tube number 1 is clear and colorless. Test tube number 2 is getting actually a little bit darker pink. You can still see the microbial suspension in it, making it a little cloudy, but definitely more pink. Test tube number 3 is clear and colorless. And test tube number 4, still a little cloudy because of the microbial suspension, but otherwise colorless. So there's our results for day 3. We'll check back tomorrow with the final results on day 4. All right, guys, here is day 4, the last day of data collection. We have test tube number 1, still clear and colorless. Test tube number 2 has actually gotten a little darker pink. So this is the darkest it's going to be. Remember, this is the tetrazolium indicator, the oil, and the microbial suspension. Test tube 3, still clear and colorless. And test tube 4, still a little cloudy. The other thing to note is you can see in test tube number 3 a differentiation, a layer of oil on top of the layer of water on the bottom. You can also see that in test tube number 1. You can see that layer of oil up at the top. If you look at test tube 4, let's start there, you don't see that layer quite as pronounced. It's not quite as large of an oil layer. And if you look at test tube number 2, again, there's a little bit, but not as pronounced as the other 2. That implies that the microbial suspension is doing what it's supposed to do and decomposing or consuming the oil in order to, for us, we use it in order to clean up an area like an oil spill. So that is your data collection for the Oil Spill Remediation Lab. Make sure you complete the Google form for your assignment.